So I decided to talk about setting the tone, which is something that seems really simple, but over to the two projects that I'm going to talk about today, I think there was quite a learning process in how we go about dealing with an audience member as they come through our experiences, and how much baggage a viewer brings with them to any piece of entertainment that they see, and you can't control that. And so sometimes it affects how they think about your content. Be that a movie, a TV show, a video game, VR experience, immersive theater show. And so I learned quite a bit about that through the process of making these last two projects. I specifically have been working in VR for the last 5 years. I think of it as an extension of interactive, and I'm very, very passionate about interactive entertainment, and I think both immersive theater and virtual reality have given me an opportunity to bring techniques from the interactive space into different formats. And so putting people into VR headsets is one of the most important scenarios in which you want to set tone for somebody, because if you're at a trade show, or you're demoing something in a conference room, or you're at home putting on a headset, I think where your mind space is before you put that headset on dramatically changes how you feel about that experience once you're inside. And that was sort of the core of what I was going to talk about today. So this is me. I'm an executive producer, so I lead on a number of projects that I'm working at MWM, as well as I was an executive producer across some projects that I did before I worked at MWM. So the two projects that I'm going to talk about today are, the first one is, did that work? Is Carne Arena, virtually presented, physically invisible, because Enritu has to have like long names for his things. There was something that we did with Alejandro and Chivo when I was at Legendary Pictures, and I spent 2 years of my life working on this thing, and it probably almost killed me. My wife didn't see me for a long period of time I was working on it, but it was an incredible experience. The next project I'm going to talk about is Chained. Yeah. Okay. Right, that's the one with applause. That's great. Chained is something that I did recently at MWM with an old friend of mine, Justin Denton, who's very much part of this community. A lot of you probably know him. And it was released earlier in the later part of last year, and we just opened it today in New York City. So I'm not there, but supposedly it's working. Haley was there. Okay, so it's great. So I think that both of these projects are super different in how they're implemented. They both have VR at the center of them, but they have similar techniques in how we dealt with audience as they came in the front door and out the back door of our experience, and making sure we were kind of controlling that experience the entire time. So when I was thinking about this talk, I always think about food, because that's kind of where my head goes all the time. And I also think about food as the ultimate immersive experience or interactive experience. You build something, you hand it to somebody. You don't really control what they're going to do after that point, but you're creating a journey and experience for that person. And I had a friend who was a chef who lived with me in college, which sounds really great, but I mean, like right out of school chefs are not the kinds of chefs that you're thinking of. Yes, but we had a lot of experiments at our college house. But he brought up this, he introduced me to this idea of a amuse-bouche, which people in the room probably know about. But it's this idea of this unintended appetizer that comes out in the first dish you get at a restaurant. And it's meant to be kind of wild and awaken your palate, but also sets the tone for the meal. And I felt like it was a really interesting metaphor for what I'm talking about today, because I think everything is food. So when we went into Carne, and we were thinking about how we were going to deal with tone on that project, we did a bunch of research, as everyone should, right? So the first thing we did was, we started talking to educational centers like Stanford Labs and Carnegie Mellon, talking about some of their programs around tracking brain activity in VR, outside of VR, and how we could make the most of all that. We also were meeting with all the hardware manufacturers at the time to try to get a sense of what they saw with their audiences, what worked with their audiences, what didn't, and how we could combine some of these methods into making sure we had the best pre-show, the best control over our audience. And then the last thing is we had this amazing team of coders who could take all of that information and put it into algorithms and create some simulated experiences that we could then use for reference when we eventually built the experience. Actually, that's not true at all. Like anything that is really good, it actually was all by accident. So, right. Stanford Labs is the real thing, though. So, Carne Arena, I don't know if everyone in the room knows what that is, so I'm just going to play a quick video. Hopefully it works. That's kind of was cut together as a bit of a teaser for the project. Cool. So yeah, Carne Arena was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity project for me where I got to work with one of the most amazing storytellers in the world in a medium that I had been studying and experimenting with for a period of time, and then to have someone like that come to the table and he really didn't have any idea what he was doing at all. He had no idea about the medium. And be able to work very closely with him through that process was, an opportunity of a lifetime. To sort of tell you a little bit more about it, if people in the room don't know, I mean, it's a moment in time in which you are in the desert while a group of immigrants are crossing the border from Mexico into the United States. And at that moment, there is a Border Patrol group who descends on them. You're in this was our installation in Cannes. This was the first installation we did. This big area in the back is a 50-foot by 50-foot VR volume that a single person had all to themselves. It was filled with sand on the floor, and you walked around it barefoot with a VR headset on, reliving this moment. All of the actors that were in it, and you saw in different technologies of geo capture and texture capture there in the video, were all real people who all went through that experience, who we changed their names because most of them were here illegally, but they were real individuals who were telling a version of their story in an amalgamation that Alejandro had created. So it was like a super crazy, powerful opportunity to do something. And Alejandro was not short to use every trick he could possibly get to make this thing amazing. So this was our first installation in Cannes. This is an actual piece of the border wall from Arizona. We found a group in Arizona that was taking down the wall and then replacing pieces of it. And we somehow got in the middle before they went to junk. and we're collecting them for like almost half a year, I think. And then we had to ship, so we shipped the border wall to France in this case, and then we eventually shipped it over to Milan, and then I think our crowning achievement is we actually shipped the wall into Mexico City and then rebuilt it in Mexico City outside of the installation we did there, which is, that in itself is like a crazy thing, but then we also made this ridiculous VR experience in the meantime. So the experience was split up into 3 major parts. This is a model that was done for our Milan installation. The first one here is what we refer to as the cold room. So this was the room where someone first came into the experience. They would enter this room, sort of like a lobby of sorts. We had it, I can't remember what the eventual temperature was, because Alejandro wanted it to be like 50 degrees and wanted people to be like freezing. They couldn't have a jacket and they were like dying in there. So it ended up being very cold, uncomfortable, super sterile, very weird. We filled it with artifacts that we had been collecting as well, similar to the process of the wall. We found a group who had been going out into the desert in Arizona and finding like children's backpacks and shoes and like just the most heartbreaking things. And we ended up just using shoes and filled the room with shoes. And then in addition to that, we asked people when they came into that room to take their shoes off and put them into a locker. So when they eventually went into the VR, they were barefoot. So it was a very psychological scenario that we were putting people in. The next big section is this VR volume. I mentioned before, 50-foot square, single-person, huge VR volume. And then after their experience, they walked down a hallway. Well, first they actually went into sort of a decompression room where they got their shoes back and kind of had a moment by themselves to think about the experience, and then walked down a hallway where they could see through the border fence to the person behind them going through the experience, and eventually ended up in this, what we called the portrait hallway, or in this case it was a room, where we had video portraits of all of the actors who were in the experience, and on screen had text of telling their story of what they went through. So super crazy powerful, well-organized installation that you see here, but it like totally did not start that way. It really, all those additional rooms came out of utility. So this is the VR volume that we had at our warehouse in Los Angeles. So we had to rent this like space in LA just to build it and figure out how the tech was going to work, and also start running people through it to see what would happen. And what we realized was that we didn't want to have people interacting with one another. We wanted to make sure people who were coming into the experience and people who were leaving the experience like were segmented from one another so that they weren't giving anything away. We also knew, because we were going to have a lot of people showing up to this thing, when we eventually installed it, that we needed some sort of like waiting room or lobby. And so we started to think about how that was going to work. But it all kind of began here, and I have such fond memories, as do some other people, I'm sure, of the time we spent like making this thing in this warehouse. Anyway, so one other anecdote I'll throw in. We also had these subwoofers that we used for the experience in order to create haptics in people that were designed by a company here in Berkeley called Meyer Audio to test the structural integrity of rockets during takeoff. They ran at a low frequency level that you can't hear, that they had built as some sort of experiment. So of course when we told Alejandro that those were a thing, he like had to have them. But they would shake this entire block. It was like a concert stack of subwoofers. And so to the point of maintaining the tone, before we had our cold room, we'd make people wait in another room on the other side of this warehouse. And they would be sitting there by themselves waiting to go into this experience, having no idea what it was going to be. And the whole building in Los Angeles would shake. And like sort of in the rainy season, it's like you can hear the rain outside, and then the whole building just rattles. It was crazy intense. But I think that intensity led us to this idea of the cold room, where we wanted to isolate people and sort of set the tone for them before they went into the experience. And this was based off of some documentaries and things that Alejandro had seen that referenced these real border detention rooms that were freezer rooms is what they called it. I think I said that earlier, where they kept them very cold. There was an indefinite amount of time that these people were held there. Oftentimes they were told to remove their shoes and jackets and other things. And I think that it's an incredibly powerful, this image is an incredibly powerful image. So to put someone in that environment and not necessarily tell them exactly, show them this picture exactly, give them that feeling and make them a bit uneasy and off of their norm. They're not coming out of the 7-Eleven like with a Snickers bar like ready to walk into Carne Arena. They were like forced into this scenario prior to putting the headset on, and that ended up being unbelievably important to where your mindset was when you went into the headset. And then, I don't have my. No, I'm just joking. The finish. I was looking for photos of the finished room, and I know I had some because there were some really funny moments of Alejandro like rearranging stuff and things in there. But I think in the end of the day, it's best that no one sees it, because when you walk into it for the first time, just like if you were to be dragged into a detention room and you'd never seen a room like that before, you were shocked and it was new and it was an uneasy experience for you. So in order to sort of save that sort of experience, and hopefully it runs again. I don't know if it's still in DC. They keep talking about opening it again. Maybe it'll open in Montreal sometime soon. But yeah, so I'm not gonna show you. So after you walked out of the cold room, you walked into the VR volume. And this is what the VR volume will look like normally. So not really maintaining that tone, but that's what it would look like. So if you came out of that cold room and walked into this room, it was sterile and a bunch of techs who've been standing there for 12 hours, like putting people through it. So they weren't really maintaining that tone. Instead, this is the installation in Cannes. As an example, I was like standing in there like all day long. So I took a couple of videos. We had a fog machine, and we had this LED bar, very Terrell sort of lighting source in the room covered with sand again. Everything else dark. You couldn't see any edges of the room at all. So this is the experience that Alejandro and Chivo wanted people to have when they walked into that room. But from there until the moment they put on their headset, like that tone was maintained. And I really feel like that was one of our strongest tactics that we had on that experience to get people into the right headspace. So that by the time they put the VR headset on, they're not challenging whether or not its visual fidelity is perfect, or if like they know where to walk, or all the normal things that we nitpick around the content like that. They were in a space in the story where they were taking their next step into that journey, and it's so incredibly important. This is me. This is a photo of me that Chivo took, although there are some that say that this is Tim Alexander, so I don't know if we'll ever know, but like I tell people it's me. So yeah, I worked on this project for 2 years. I took it to 4 countries. We built it in a lot of different ways throughout that process, but this idea of creating and maintaining that tone from the moment someone stepped foot at the location through until they left was something that we learned deeply on this project. So let me move on. Now I'm gonna move on to my next project, which is Chained. Like I said before, these are very different projects. Where one was sort of documentary in a way, documentary fine art installation, Chained is very much an immersive theater show. It is a retelling of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, in which we put you at the center of that story. So there's no Scrooge. I wouldn't say you're Scrooge, you're yourself, but you're going through that story, meeting the ghosts of present, past, and future, while inside an immersive theater experience that also takes you to some fantastical digital environments via VR. I also wanted to say that Justin Denton, who I mentioned earlier, the director, has this deep love for the text and also for the more gothic and fearful, haunting aesthetic that it originally represented, and felt that over the years of Disney's and other sort of stage performances, that story had sort of been lost, and that aesthetic had been lost. He definitely took it a little bit further over the edge, but it was a beautiful retelling that we used an amazing art team to redesign. The sort of, lack of a better term, kind of gimmick, or the thing that we were wanting to explore with this project that made it very different, was putting a live actor at the center of the experience who was in motion capture equipment, live driving a digital character that you interacted with. We were very inspired by this piece that the DV group out of France did called Alice, in which you put on a VR headset and you walked into a room and there was a digital character and it was talking to you, it was handing you things, it was conversing with you. And we thought that this technique was the absolute perfect thing for the Dickens story, because you're experiencing these different ghosts who can kind of be the same character, they're kind of not, and it really was an opportunity to showcase how far this tech could go in having, this is Michael Bates, by the way, who is unbelievably amazing, who created the characters. Yeah, Michael, for sure. So Haley, who's here as well, who was one of our other actors, and Michael were very integral in creating the story. Beyond just like, here's a script and they read the part, the blocking and design of the experience was at the core, a collaboration from the acting team, from the tech team, and from Justin's vision. So Michael was a huge part of creating these characters, creating their voice, creating the process in which he would lead them through the experience to make sure that they were seeing and doing the right things. But it wouldn't have been as easy if we hadn't been able to set the tone for the person before they walked in and control their mind space before they walked into this room and spent the second half of this experience with Michael. And I don't know if I explained it well enough because it's complicated when I explain, but like the idea of Michael is like in that room, but when you're in the VR headset, you're seeing a complete digital character that he's live puppeteering. He like reaches out, he touches you on the shoulder, he'll hand you things, you can talk to him. It's pretty incredible. So here is an image, an original concept that we had done for this living room. That you kind of first walk into, and it's dark, it's also beautiful, and this moment where you meet the first ghost is such an important moment in that experience that it's not something that, again, you can just sort of put a headset on somebody and push them into this room and then have that moment happen. The pacing needed to be right in order for that to be achieved. So we started the process of setting the tone in the lobby, actually. So here's a photo of the lobby of our installation in Los Angeles. And you walk in the door, you meet our greeter, and from that moment forward, you're in the tone that's being set by Justin and the team. So there's some music playing, Victorian furniture, everything is very controlled in this setup. At that point, you don't actually see anything that is the play. You're really waiting, you're looking at some concept art. The first step is you walk into our first room, which has this door in it. So it's a door, doesn't have any handle on it. You have these two sconces, something like that, lights that are lighting the room. So there's this very obvious, transformation for the world that you started into the world that we're creating. And this is kind of the next step in sort of taking that tone. And then the third step, and probably the most important step, is the step that Haley played here in literally bringing the audience member into that room and into that story, and immediately engaging with them in a way that is both chilling and confusing and just an incredible. I mean, I don't want to, because she's here. It's hard to sort of compliment her so much, but like that room was the pinnacle point of our experience that set the tone. You were completely stripped of any sense of what the reality was, and you understood that you were in this story now. And there was no confusion about, well, what's this headset do? What does what am I going to see next? Do I have to do something? Are you going to hand me something? Like, what do the controllers do? It was like so clean. So yeah, I love this photo because every time I've done the experience, like that's that moment where I know that I'm in this narrative. And then the next photo, I find this photo for me, and I think for the team, is very representational of that key moment of transitioning between the physical and the digital. And there was a ton of work done into making sure that that was finessed in how we process that. And the transition between Haley and Michael was seamless for the user. And this is a very early photo from our development, but I think it shows you kind of the key people, the key roles, I should say, in that the actors were at the center of helping us design that moment, and Justin, terrified, looking on, making sure it's going to be good. But I think Chained was evolved past the idea of what we were doing with Carne, whereas Carne was about putting you in a moment of confusion and vulnerability, where in Chained, we are intentionally trying to put you in a specific space, in a specific mind space, so that when we eventually pulled you into the experience, you knew where you were, you knew what the story was, you knew what your role was, which is very difficult to do. And so I think the tone that we were able to set from the beginning to the end of Chained was the things that I learned the most from Carne. So anyways, I'm kind of like trailing off now, but that's kind of my presentation. I can kind of open up for Q&A. I don't know how much time I have left. Thank you. 30 minutes? Yes, up in front.
Yes, I think that using live actors is an awesome thing. It's a lot of stuff that I do. It's costly.
Yes.
So I believe in it artistically. What are your plans and goals and thoughts for, not that everything needs to be about money, but it is a part of it.
Sure.
So I'm curious to know where you see it going, where you see these explorations going to.
Yeah, I think Chained is an interesting project because we're in a kind of a pivot point in how location-based virtual reality entertainment is operating. And my perspective, someone who's been part of that space for a while and been watching it, seeing it go further and further towards, games at a family fun center or little tiny like IP attached projects, and not opportunities to tell deep stories or use the techniques to go beyond the entertainment that we're used to consuming. That was a major part of why we went after to make Chained. I think the techniques for pulling that off were expensive and difficult. But I also believe that, I totally agree, I think having live actors at the center of the experience, being able to move with you, react to you, it's stronger than any AI that you could create in a game space. Currently. Yeah, maybe soon. But I think what we hope is that something like Chain, we can continue to showcase it as a kind of a loss leader of sorts. As that technique, we can find ways to make it more accessible and do other projects in the future with the same space, hopefully with a larger throughput and a better economic output. So here in the front.
When you were working with Inuri 2, did he know that he wanted to make it in virtual reality at the start? Or was there considerations for analog as well? Which was definitely a new experience.
Yeah, it was. It started as a VR project, and then all the analog came later.
So at what point was there an inflection point to say that part of the story needs to be analog, part of the story needs to be in VR, besides technical constraints?
I mean, I don't know what he would say, but my read on it was that I think at a certain point, and this happens oftentimes with film directors or people who don't understand the technical limitations of the medium. I think that he wasn't sure if we were going to get there. We were going to get to a place where the characters felt real. And at that point, he started to try to identify other ways that we could create the tone of this experience that then, when carried into the headset, lessened the impact of you like staring at their eyes and to see if they look great, or what people do when they try to break things and and criticize the graphical capabilities of something like that.
And then your cold room is actually refrigerated?
Yeah. Yeah. I'll jump over here.
What was the production timeline on both of those big projects for yourself?
It's hard to say on Carne because I want to say it was like almost 2 years, year and a half. There was a period of time where the project was in an incubation where we were playing around the idea of Carne before it turned into the real thing that we eventually went into production on. I would say probably about a year and a half. And then Chained, we did it in a much faster timeline, more like 6 to 8 months.
Ooh, I get a microphone. So your talk in terms of setting the tone, can you talk a little bit about that transition? I mean, we're in the Victorian era, where it's Dickens. How do you incorporate that VR headset and make that transition? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think we thought a lot about dressing it up, like turning it into something else. Like at one point it was going to be like a top hat or an overcoat or something that we were going to turn it into a prop. And the more, there was an expense related to that and also concerns related to hardware failure and how that might be hard to manipulate when we had a ticketed event and making sure everything worked. So really, my feeling was at a certain point it actually came down to the tone in the room and the interactivity in the room. You were so vulnerable to Marley in that room that she eventually sits you down and then brings the VR headset over and puts it on you. And I don't really think that it needed any more treatment. Yes, exactly. It was considered part of the narrative for sure. That was more of the direct answer you needed, sorry.
With Chained, can you talk a little bit about the how and the why of closing the experience with the physical artifact that the user could take away?
Yeah, I think, I think immersive theater shows feel like memories, feel like moments in time more than they feel like a piece of entertainment. And so because of that, I think having a physical object draws you back to that memory in some way. And I know that I have collected playbills and things that I've gotten along the way. I've also heard stories of people who try to steal stuff out of Sleep No More to have a memento of their own. It was really something that Justin felt strongly about, and it was a way for that story to continue with you after you left. And I don't really want to talk about the ending of the experience, but I think that the way that the experience ends, it has a real sense of a learning moment that you're supposed to take with you. And I think that object reminds you of that.
Hi. So everything you've done has been basically theater for one. Carne is gorgeous. I loved it. I have a very, very interesting story to tell you about it, my experience of it, because there was like a bomb threat while I was in there. It was very crazy. It got very intense. But the whole experience was absolutely stunning and chained as well. So I love those experiences, but I go to the theater for community.
Sure.
I go to experience with multiple people. And there are a couple of companies that are making those steps into the communal VR experience. But can you talk a little bit from these like deeply immersive worlds, how do you see that moving forward?
Specifically community?
How do you see kind of group interactivity or being able to be more than just an audience of one?
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's a matter of technical inability. I think that capability is there, and there's a lot of. It's funny, depending on what industry you work in. Is it multiplayer, or is it social VR, or is it community experience? Like, I think that exists, and I think actually DV has gone on to do really great stuff with more community people that are in there. I think it's for us. It wasn't really about like the design of either experience. Wasn't about the design of this as a community event as much as it was how do we tell a story to you as a person. Chained is even more so about you. So if there are multiple people in there, it kind of changes the dynamic. And I've done some other projects besides these two. These are just two that I felt like had a similar thing that I could compare against one another. I think that you'll see more and more of that stuff happening. But I think when it comes to VR tech, putting a bunch of people in a room and then having a single projector create content is the same cost to do the same for one person, whereas VR is exponentially more complicated as you add more and more headsets. And you see lots of people doing that. I mean, the Void and Dreamscape and Nomadic, and there's a lot of those types of companies that are doing those things. So I just stay tuned to the future, I guess. I don't have anything in the works. I don't know if that was the question. I don't have anything going in that direction, but I think it's a totally attainable thing. I think it's about story.
So I had a question about like length of these experiences. So a lot of VR experiences are sitting in like the 10 to 20 minute range, and I'm wondering sort of what drives that. Is it like capacity? Is it the ability to stay in VR for that long? Is it to sort of bring new people in as like just to sort of dip their toe in the water? So
it's capacity.
Because it's, okay, is it? I figured so.
I mean, I think if you go back 5 years, people were like, VR is supposed to be 90 seconds long because that's all people made was 90 seconds worth of VR. And I think that there are arguments against like, oh, after a certain amount of time you get sick, and I think all that stuff is bullshit. I think our problems we were having earlier on around content length were due to that content just not being interesting, and us not knowing the visual language to use in those experiences to create a story, and so. The Carne and Chained are both, we cut down Chained quite a bit because at a certain point you're like, okay, throughput's obviously a problem, we know that, but like this is ridiculous. We want more people to see this. So I think the 25-minute range right now is something that just seems like on the upper end of accessible length of time for something like that.
How's it going?
Good.
I saw Chained and it was incredible.
Dope.
I want to talk a little bit about your tactile and kind of like haptic feedback.
Sure.
I noticed there was like a fireplace that when I walked closer to it, it was a little bit warmer. And then there's also some elements to it. I don't want to spoil anything, but you have some modular set design inside your space. Can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah, I mean, I think,
Carne had fans and subwoofers, and I'm not really a big believer in 4D. I think it cheapens the experience, and I think sometimes it's overused in order to create a element of the experience that you can't get across in the content itself. So you like put a thing there, or you put a fan there, because they're like, if you should be able to feel the helicopter without having wind blow on you, it's additive, but it's like at the same time it's sort of something you're missing from the content itself. On Chained, in the beginning, we were like, all right, we're going to build the whole environment. We'll build all the stuff, and you can touch everything, and you walk around. And then we ended up sort of reducing that down to the props and pieces that were core to the story, which is really interesting. And as those elements ended up being more core to the story from a finishing perspective, so they were receiving the final lighting, the direction, stage management by the actors were driving people to certain parts of that stage. It was very rare, I don't think as I've ever seen anybody reach for something that wasn't there. It probably has happened. But most of the time, people walk in and immediately grab the one thing we've built because it just is part of the story. And then when it comes to sort of, because there are multiple scenes within Chained that take place in the same footprint, we worked with a prop house to build transformer beds that like turn from one thing into another. And that was its own challenge in how do we integrate that process into the stage management, which was an interesting exploration and minimizing that work so it didn't distract from the actors or didn't create too much noise, but at the end of the day, it allowed us to have a single prop that could serve multiple purposes.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I actually have a question that builds on that comment.
Sure.
I'm super interested in the alignment of the physical and the virtual world. And in terms of how that preps, because many times I think people are coming to experiences like Chained aren't fully aware that the actors are embodied or in person. But when you're asked to sit on the bed as like one of the early design decisions, I think that prompts you for understanding the alignment between the virtual and physical. And I'm one of those people who like tries to touch the system, so I tried to grab all the things that maybe were not grabbable.
Samantha,
what I'm super interested in is the sense of intimacy and touch with the actors.
Yeah.
So that was something that I was really honing in on, is like the perception, the haptics of even like the actor. I know that, you know, like touching your head gently to grab the cord is like, that's something that just has to happen by nature of technology, but that's background. But the fact that I wanted to almost like, you know, like I wanted to feel the contours of the actors, like I felt, you know, the contours of the furniture, but then I was like, what is the, you know, the negotiable line of intimacy in that was something I was super interested in.
Yeah, I think that we explored that a lot too, and like what amount of touch is the appropriate amount of touch? You know, when are you creating an experience that is leading the user versus something that is a full-on interactive moment between two people? You know, you know, I think it would be a really great question for Michael and for Haley in talking about Michael Bates, the actor, because I think it was something that we worked on, and Justin worked on a lot in figuring out what amount of touch was appropriate. I think the other, I sit more on the technical side of things, so I think from a technical perspective, Michael's wearing like pajamas with like balls all over it, and then he's got this like armature coming off his face with a light and a camera like shooting him in the face, and then these like weird things on his hands that track his fingers. So there is an element of like keeping space. And I think we wanted to have that sense of proximity. So Michael very often would be so close to you that you don't realize it, but his actual head cam is below where your VR headset is. He's as close as he can get before he bangs into you. So I think that there were a number of times where people like went to touch him and would like grab the armature or like run into something else. And my opinion of that is that it's experiment. Experimentation, how far can you push it? Where do you end up? You find the finesse in the end. And I think that that's it. I think I'm being, they're shining flashlights at me.
Ethan, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.